Actually, it's important. It's all transient.
Hello, everyone. Good evening. This will get started. Thanks for coming out. I'm Eric Dawson. I am head of the McClung Historical Collection here in the History Center up on the 3rd floor. And I was quite pleased when Professor Bill Hardwig contacted me about this event. Bill and I have worked together on a few things before, and I was glad that now that he's got his book coming out, How Cormac Works, that he wanted to do that here and us to be part of it. And I'm glad that he wanted the Denbo Center to be a part of it. Katie Burnett, I heard she'd been appointed, and I knew Katie sort of casually from back when, and I've been meaning to reach out and see how we might collaborate, and this fell on my lap, so thanks Bill, thanks Katie. And Dean Steve Smith and I also have talked over the years about doing things, so I'm glad he's able to join us as well. Should be an interesting program, 3 parts. Bill and Katie are going to have a conversation about Bill's new book. And then Dean Steve Smith's going to come up and talk about some of the Cormac McCarthy action that's been going on over at Hodges Library and some recent acquisitions. And then I'm going to come up and talk about some of the film and photographs in the McClung Collection in Tamas related to Cormac McCarthy, sort of attack, connected to, let's say. There's nothing that he created, but it's connected to. First though, I want to welcome everybody, and if you don't mind, I want to plug a couple of events we have coming up. It is Tamas's 20th anniversary, Tennessee Archive of Moving Image and Sound. Founded 20 years ago as a nonprofit, became part of the Knox County Public Library. Tomorrow night at Zool Brewing Company, we're having a fundraising anniversary event, Vintage Balls and Know-It-Alls. We've got a lot of our UT Balls football footage and created a trivia event around it. It's going to be fun. Bob Kessling is going to be the trivia master, and he too will be on hand as well, so come on out to that. And then this Sunday, there's going to be a really good program back here based around the photographic works of Jim Thompson and George Massa, 2 photographers who were instrumental in getting the Smoky Mountains turned into a great Smoky Mountain National Park. That's at 2 o'clock on Sunday, so I hope you can join us then. But for tonight's program, I want to introduce our first speakers. Professor Bill Hardwig has held the Department of English's Carroll Distinguishing Teacher Professorship. He's received the College of Arts and Sciences Excellence in Teaching Award for junior faculty and the John C. Hodges Excellence in Teaching Award. He's also written a few books, one of which, what's the first, has quite a lengthy title, I can't think of.
Let's just say Upon Provincialism.
Upon Provincialism.
That's the short title.
Short title. And Katie Burnett joined the Denbo Center just this year as the full-time associate director. Her research focused on 19th century literature, literature of the U.S. South, and literary representations of enslavement. Before that, she served as associate professor of English and the chair of arts and languages, coordinator of English and gender studies at Fisk University in Nashville, Tennessee. So welcome to you both, and really excited to hear about this new book. Yeah.
Thanks, Eric. Can everyone hear me okay? I'm a soft talker. So when Bill and I were talking about what we wanted to do for this, we wanted to keep it fairly chill, and we're structuring it as, we were structuring it more as a conversation. I say this so you kind of have an idea of what we're doing, and also it's a way of excusing if we mess up or bumble or do anything weird. So this isn't formal, so it's okay. Yeah, we'll be doing kind of like a back and forth in that way. So let's get started. Be cool. You want to say anything?
Yeah, it's also a little bit planned, so it'll be a very awkward conversation too.
Yeah. So I wanted to start with a very, very deep dive into the book and get into the nitty gritty and talk about the title. So that was one of the first things that struck me about the book was just obviously the cover is gorgeous, which it's the first striking thing. But the second thing was the title, How Cormac Works, which I really loved. And I know you always kind of are self-deferential and deprecating about this, but you're really good at titles. So what the effect was for me was calling it How Cormac Works kind of immediately sets it forth as this it's very comfortable, it seems kind of familiar, and it sort of sets me up for like what I'm about to get into, which is a very comfortable, familiar book, but it's also pretty hard-hitting. So I guess I wanted to kind of get you to just talk about the title a little bit more. Like, how did you think about it? How did you think about phrasing it? And what emphasizing the like how over the what, which is really like the main thesis of the book.
Yeah, so one of the things that I really felt I was trying to do that's different about this book than anything I've done before, and I think different than a lot of McCarthy scholars, is to do that, to focus less on the what McCarthy's writing about, what are his beliefs, what are his ethics, what are his characters saying, and more on the how. Like how McCarthy structures his fiction, how this structure contributes to his literary style, and how the style creates unique reading experiences for the people who engage with his work carefully. So that's part of it, is emphasizing the how. That's part of that. But as you maybe saw from Eric's introduction, where he said my title was very long of my first book, despite Katie's nice words, I think presses think I'm horrible at choosing covers and titles. My last book, they suggested the change of the title, and they asked me what I wanted on the cover, and I had this idea of train maps. And they said, son, we are not putting train maps on the cover. So this one I just said, I have no idea. Put whatever you want on the cover. I trust the design team. Look how lucky I am for that. They did such a good job. But sort of interestingly in the discussion of it, somebody at LSU on the staff liked the idea of how McCarthy works instead. And I think that had to do with search algorithms, the idea of what would make it pop up or where people would find it on the internet. I think there's a lot of merit to that. But I pushed back on that one successfully. And the reason I did is sort of the things you mentioned, Katie, is that Cormac, the idea of Cormac first name is not something that we often see in academic books. And it brings an intimacy to it, I think, a little bit of familiarity to the title, which I tried to create. And I wanted the sort of the image of a human being working at his desk writing his fiction. That was sort of what I was thinking there. And as well as the personal responses of the readers have to that writing. So it's also the way it works, the way that this fiction works for the readers. And that's sort of what I try to do in this book more generally, is to explore the relationship between the author, what the author writes, and the reader, what the reader takes from that. It's sort of a give and take in the way that I see it. In the book I talk about modes, which are the sort of technical ways that I see Cormac structuring his work, and then the moods, which are the sort of more slippery ways that we respond to, and it creates feelings in us and stuff like that. So that's the main reason I thought that title. I also think it works a little bit because Cormac is a very distinctive name. If you're not a fan of second century Irish fiction, there was a history. There was a King Cormac, which is people think is where he got his name from, because originally he was Charles, and then Charlie, and then CJ. So Cormac is sort of a self-selected name. If I were doing a book on Shakespeare, I'm not sure how William Works would work so well. So Cormac helped me out with that very distinctive name.
And it kind of illustrates the thoughtfulness and the focus on style that is throughout the book too, because that kind of deliberate choice of moving from Charles to Charlie to Cormac, it kind of demonstrates some of the things that you're pointing out in a lot of his fiction and his writing too. So that kind of like thoughtful quality too. Yeah. But one of the other things that I liked about the book, and you know, it is a book talk, so I have to like tell Bill how awesome this book is all the time, but was that it didn't turn into a hagiography, you know, where it was just basically, look how amazing Cormac is the whole time. That you weren't really afraid to be critical of some of the things, and even say, hey, like he's very overly stylistic sometimes, to the extent of like maybe sometimes that emphasis on style doesn't necessarily make it easier to read or even likable. And so I love that you didn't shy away from that, but you still brought an appreciation to it and kind of affected that balance between like not overpraising but also being appreciative. So I wondered if you could talk about that a little bit more. Like, how do you affect that balance of being critical but still appreciating?
Yeah, a couple of thoughts is I definitely didn't want this to be a fan fiction about McCarthy. I wasn't trying to write that. I also wasn't trying to convince people that even though he was the odds favorite to win the Nobel Prize in 2007 or somewhere around then, after The Road and No Country for Old Men, that was deserving. I wasn't trying to make that kind of intervention. And my interest also isn't particularly biographical. I don't care that much about the life he lived, the person he was beneath this. Instead, it's a very, to me, a very formal, my interest is primarily formal, meaning that the surprising ways that he writes to me, the way his fiction operates, and in a way that I find truly unique. I don't think I can think of other writers that sort of do some of the things he does in his style. So that's why I bring style in the title as well. And the kernel of this project actually began all the way back, I think, in 2012. I was working on an article for studies in American literary naturalism. And the book was on, or the article I was writing was on The Road, McCarthy's The Road, and if you guessed it, naturalism. And so I was doing something very different, but when I was working on that and reading The Road, I found something that really changed my approach to McCarthy. And that's like, if you are familiar with The Road, you'll know that he writes the paragraph that has large blank spaces, white space, and then another paragraph without transition, and almost like these little intense epigrams that sort of build off of each other. And I came across this one passage that I'll share a little bit with here in just a second, where each of the 5 consecutive paragraphs were different in mood, tone, perspective, first person, third person, formal, informal, poetic, rigid, and I thought that I couldn't think of anybody else that sort of jumped around formally and with moods in that way. So, and that ended up making it into this book too. So I'm not going to read the whole passage, but I thought what I would do is just sort of show you what I mean by, I'm going to read the introduction of 5 consecutive paragraphs. I'll just read, so this is from The Road. I'll just read like the first sentence or two, but I think you'll get an idea of what I mean here. So the first paragraph. So this is sort of in the middle of well, sort of in the beginning of the book, but not right at the beginning. It's in the first 30 pages. So first paragraph. It was colder. Nothing moved in that night world. A rich smell of wood smoke hung over the road. He pushed the cart on through the snow. Then we get a little bit more into the second paragraph. In this dream, she was sick, and he cared for her. The dream bore a look of sacrifice, but he thought differently. Third paragraph. On this road there are no God-spoke men. They are gone, and I am left, and they have taken with them the world. Query, how does the never-to-be differ from what never was? Fourth paragraph. Dark of invisible moon, the night's now only slightly less black. And then fifth example. People sitting on the sidewalk in the dawn, half dim-lit and smoking in their clothes, like failed sectarian suicides. And so here we have, the first paragraph has a stark description of a post-apocalyptic world. Then you come to the second one, and suddenly it's where the dream that the man had, the father had, of his wife before her death by suicide. This one's very personal and introspective and sort of filled with his guilt as the paragraph develops. You get to the third paragraph, and it's a more philosophical tone, and the reader is given direct access to the man's thoughts, which hadn't happened in the other ones. It says, they are gone, and I am left, and they have taken with them the world. So that first person interior thought. You get to the fourth paragraph, and we are kicked out of these internal and personal moments to a more objective description of the present landscape. The language becomes more poetic, and the paragraph resonates with a sort of pared down naturalistic descriptions, dark of invisible moon, etc. And then the final paragraph in this example is a flashback in heightened language where the man has proved himself. But this doesn't really sound like the man's voice. It's sort of close to his, but it also sounds a little bit different. So it really struck me as, I can't think of another author that has 5 consecutive paragraphs with such different perspectives. So that's sort of what set me on the journey of this book, is just sort of think about all the modes that he inhabits and all the moods he creates and the way that he writes about stuff. About the idea of not writing a hagiography is, I think that his style is different and it works for me. One of the things I like is that the styles can be so different from book to book. But as Katie mentions, for other people's, the style actually becomes a problem. They're too stylized. And that's been true of receptions of his work since the very first one, where people say the style gets in the way of the story he wants to tell. So, I think it's not my challenge. I didn't see it as my challenge to try to convert readers to McCarthy, but I did want to think through his work in a careful way for those who enjoy it in a way that's hopefully beneficial and maybe even enjoyable.
Well, why, Bill, that was a lovely segue to my next question. Okay, but actually, in terms of likability, so one of my favorite sections of the book is your discussion of how McCarthy is perceived, especially for someone who isn't necessarily McCarthy. I was really fascinated by that, just like how people receive him and how people read him and how people react to him. And you use this kind of now infamous interview he did with Oprah as a touchstone to kind of to illustrate. And conveniently enough, we have a picture of it to illustrate how this like ethos develops around him. And so, one, I was wondering if you could talk about this because, as you can see, people want to hear. But two, I'm kind of interested in thinking about those characterizations of McCarthy's intentions that surround that. Specifically, there's this sort of interest in portraying McCarthy like that as this gruff curmudgeon, but you make this very deliberate attempt to show these tender moments that emerge in a lot of his writing. And so I guess I have a couple of different questions. Like, one, talk about that. Two, what do you think fans and readers get out of characterizing McCarthy as that gruff curmudgeon when you so obviously point out that there's so many ways where he really belies that characterization? So, like, what do we do with that? Like, why? And then second, like, what do you think we get from seeing him in different ways? From seeing him as something more tender and kind of contrary to that?
Yeah.
That was a lot. So.
Yeah, that was
But we
more than two questions.
Yeah.
But yeah, I can look at this a little bit. First, I have to thank Palmer Murphy for allowing me to put that in the book, because I really think it is a striking image. It's a comic he did in 2007. And I do think it speaks to the climate of how people receive that interview, but also I think for me some sort of misconceptions about McCarthy that not from Murphy's necessarily, but the sort of public perception. So this actually shows up in a section of the book on tenderness and tender language, which I'll get to in a second. But so I think the idea of this is, as Katie sort of said, he's sitting over there kind of steely and gruff, and Oprah Winfrey's over there, maybe bemused or surprised or uncertain of what to do, and a huge gulf between them. And in between, if you've read McCarthy's book, you'll recognize these characters and there's these scenes, and they're all the moments of graphic violence, disturbing, scenes and that kind of stuff. And so I think the impression sort of playing up on here is that McCarthy's commitment to violence was too much for Oprah Winfrey. But then I started to think about it when I looked at this. I said, that's just ridiculous. By this point, Oprah Winfrey has already had as her book of, in her book club Beloved, which is every bit as violent and gruesome and unrelenting as any McCarthy's work. You could argue more so. She even played the role of Sante in the Beloved film, so she is not overwhelmed by the tenderness. So this does speak, I think, to a misconception of McCarthy as, sort of like as a writer for men who glorify hyper-masculine violence. And I wasn't quite sure if that was the case when I started teaching classes on it, but I found that's not. I did not want a class where it was just 20-year-old men and me in a class. So that's what I was a little bit worried about. But that's actually not the case. They're great classes. And I think part of the reason is because that is a misconception that he's just glorifying violence. And I think, one of the things, the reason why violence does show up so much in his work is I do think that he believes very strongly that the idea that we as a society have convinced ourselves that we're moving our way or developing out of violence. And I think he sees that as inaccurate and dangerous to believe that. So I think he wants to keep reminding us that violence is part of the human experience. We maybe need that reminding a little less now than in sometimes, but just the idea that violence is a key part of it. So he is interested in violence, for sure. But what I try to do in this book, and I won't talk about it too much, but I talk about what I call his tender mode, and that's where, even when he's talking about some of the most gruesome scenes, some of the most violent stuff, he uses, at the level of language, a real tenderness to it. So it's often this horrific subject matter with a very, very tender language used to describe it. And what that does is it creates a sort of incommensurability between the language that is discussing the stuff and the subject matter being discussed. There's a critic, David James, who once said about The Road specifically that McCarthy's language can sometimes misbehave, like not fit with the plot. And I think that's a nice way of thinking about it more generally. He's just thinking about The Road, but just that he often tries to unsettle what it is he's talking about through his use of language. So that's another reason where the formal focus on style and language is really a key part of this. I'm not going to talk about that in detail here because we don't have a lot of time, but if you're interested in that, if you go to LSU Press's Facebook page, I had a book launch talk where I talk about the tender mode, and I show some places in his writing where he does that.
And one of the reasons I wanted to ask this question is because what really struck me about something that you were saying, that you really make a point of developing a lot more thoroughly in the book, so you should go read it. But is that it's kind of always there in a lot of McCarthy's writing, and even a little bit in some of the biographical stuff. I know I was just saying, oh, we don't want to turn this into a biographical thing, and I like that. But I was struck by it. I believe this is in chapter 3. Where Bill pulls out this clip from McCarthy's high school newspaper, and it's this sort of like profile of him. And I was saying to Bill when we were talking about this conversation that what really struck me after reading his tenderness chapter is how you can see the tenderness even in this just like little description of Charlie McCarthy. Where on the surface, it seems like it should maybe be, for lack of a better word, kind of creepy. You know, this kid who's like into taxidermy and like roaming along in the woods. But the phrasing of it is so lovely. It's like at the foot of Brown's Mountain, you know, there's a sweetness to it. And it's interesting because it's something that, in spite of this characterization, you kind of see that as an undercurrent and kind of like a play back and forth between that tenderness and like kind of like brutality throughout all of this stuff. And so because you established it fairly well in that early chapter, when I got to this part, I was like, oh yeah, tenderness, man, I see it. Okay, so next question. Great. Okay. So the next part, we're getting more into the kind of literary criticism stuff. In the introduction, when you're setting up this focus on the style and the form of McCarthy's writing, you quote from this Peter Mendelssohn book, What We See When We Read, where you begin with the question posed in the title, and he writes here, other than what do we see when we read, other than words on a page? What do we picture in our minds? And this is the kind of like Barbara Walters question that I have for you. What do you see when you read, Bill? But specifically, like, is there a passage or a section of a McCarthy piece that really kind of stands out to you, especially since you're focusing so much on style and form and the way things are writing? And why was that passage so illustrative for you? And should I turn on?
Sure.
You want to do yours first? Or
No, go ahead.
Okay. Well, to kick us off, I picked one for myself, like from you, right? Yeah. So on the left here is a quote from Bill's book where he says, like, the language McCarthy uses in his fiction, in other words, creates a feeling or a mood that is often at odds with the scenes and subject matter being described. So kind of like that play between tenderness and grotesquerie. And so for me, it's a passage that's always stood out, or the section that's always stood out, is in Child of God. And for the folks like Sarah in the front row who have read Child of God, I was wanting to put like a lengthier quote, and then I was like, ooh, okay, I'll do that in public. And so it's very excerpted, if anyone's familiar with it. But to give it a little context, in Child of God, what's being described here is a dead body who is essentially being treated as this guy's wife. And for some reason, that moment has always stuck out to me is like how tender and how lovely, and I can just picture him holding this like dead body in his arms. Okay, everyone's shutting down now. So yeah, and so that was the one that stood out to me because of that interplay between tenderness and kind of violence. So what's yours?
Yeah, no, I think that's a good example because that's where exactly a scene where the language does something to our reception of it. If anybody's seen the movie of Child of God, it's really disturbing and in my mind, not that much fun. And I think the reason why is all the stuff that he's writing about in creative ways with tenderness and sort of interesting, sometimes images and all that kind of stuff. We just see it as brutal gore in the film, so we actually watch it there, whereas often in McCarthy's description, we aren't actually told the sort of brutal details of the brutality. So that's a great example of something like that. Because we've already talked about the tenderness stuff, I thought I might read something a little bit different. And this isn't exactly about that incommensurate language, but it is McCarthy's ability to take language, defamiliarize something we're very familiar with, and make us see it in a new light. He's very good at natural descriptions. And so I thought I would read a thing from The Passenger. I also thought maybe those of us who, maybe not many of us have read The Passenger since it came out more recently. And since we build this as a Knoxville thing, I thought I would center it around something in Knoxville. So this is him talking about one of his favorite subjects, and that's the stone quarries in South Knoxville. He lived in South Knoxville as a kid. He used to wander around. And he talks quite frequently in his books about wandering around in the stone quarries. And so this is one that he revisits that at the end of his career. So his first book was 1965, and he talks about visiting the quarries. And then he comes back to sort of the same thing in 2022. So that's almost 6 decades later, right? So I just thought I would read a passage of that, because I think he starts with some stuff that's familiar and then kind of does some new stuff with that. As you'll see, I always pictured the Keyhole Trail here as the scene he's describing in this. I'm not sure that's the case, but that's the one. So these images for me capture the thing he's describing here. In the morning, he left the house at dawn and walked up the road to the bridge and crossed the fields to the old quarry, following the faint ruts of the quarry road into the woods. Some crows dropped down out of the trees on the ridge above him and flew away in silence. Great square blocks of stone stood in the woods beyond. The stone was the same color as the tree trunks in the amphitheater in the woods. A flat stone floor and 2-step levels and a reflecting pool, still and deep and black. The walls rose up on 3 sides and blocks ribbed with flutings where feather drills had been used to bore them for the dynamite. And I love that description, but I want to just read one more paragraph where he does something a little different with it, through the idea of a memory. He crossed the low wall of sawn blocks opposite the pool and sat as he had sat that summer evening years ago and watched his sister perform the role of Medea alone on the quarry floor. She was dressed in a gown she'd made from sheeting, and she wore a crown of woodbine in her hair. The footlights were fruit cans packed with rags and filled with kerosene. The reflectors were foil, and the black smoke rose unto the summer leaves above her and set them trembling while she strode the swept stone floor in her sandals. When it was over, he stood and clapped, the flat dead echo halting off the quarry walls. She curtsied twice, and then she was gone, striding off into the dark, the shadows of the trees, bowing to her in the lights from her lantern where hung by the veil. So just, to me, a lovely description of Knoxville, the Knoxville setting, but then doing something a little different with that idea of Medea. Because I don't know if you guys walk through those quarries. I always feel like I'm in ancient Greek, in these ancient Greece, and these toppled stones are like the ancient temples. So I like the way that you played with that.
I feel like that's probably
I think
a good segue into the next part that we're going to talk about, specifically Dean Smith, and talking about the McCarthy Collection, the McCarthy Archives. And so do you want to...
Yeah, the way we're going to do this is we have these 3 parts, and just to sort of keep it moving along, we're going to hold questions and conversation till afterwards, but we'll have opportunity to talk about all 3 there. And so let me introduce Dean Smith, and then we will get going. And just as a sort of, well, I'll just introduce him and then tell you a little bit about what these images are. So Steve Smith is the Bruce and Nancy Sullivan Dean of the University of Tennessee Libraries and the University Press. A longtime leader in academic libraries, he joined UT in 2011 after 2 decades at Texas A&M University. When you talk to him, I still think he's got a little Aggie in him, but we won't get into that today. A major theme of his career has been special collections, rare books, and archives, and he has overseen major building projects dedicated to their care, including the funding and planning and construction of UT's new 15,000 square foot high-density storage facility for archive and primary source materials opening in early 2027. So that's really exciting and important. And over his career, Smith has played a leading role in building significant collections as well as rare individual books and items. Listen to this, at Texas A&M, these included the George R.R. Martin papers, the Edwin Forrest Shakespeare Second Folio from 1632, a 1615 second edition of Don Quixote, the first edition of Leaves of Grass, 1855, the Cervantes Project Collection, and the Al Lohman Southwest Printing Arts Archive. At Tennessee has helped secure some treasures such as Andrew Jackson's Family Bible, the Wilma Dykeman Papers, the Chimney Tops 2 Wildfire Oral History Collection, and the Buford Delaney Archive. And soon, which we'll talk about today, over 16,000 books from the personal library of Cormac McCarthy. And now under his leadership, the UT Libraries now ranks 21st among UT or U.S. public academic libraries recognized for innovative programs that engage students and support scholars across the university and beyond. And just before I call up Dean Smith, I just wanted to say a little bit about where this book project came to be. I learned about it in July 2024 when a few of McCarthy scholars, we were called to Cormac McCarthy's house to catalog all his books. When he died a little bit before, he had all these storage facilities, and they took them all out of there and stuffed them in his house. But people were afraid that they would be gotten rid of before people knew what they were. So we went there and we cataloged all those books. So this is his house. Can you just do one more? And here we are cataloging some of those books out on the porch. And here is members of the McCarthy Society. That's Stacy Peebles holding the typewriter, and she's the president of the McCarthy Association, and Lydia Cooper next to her is the vice president. So that's McCarthy's typewriter, so that's why we're all geeking out over that. So and we didn't know what would happen with the books, and we're sort of rushing to catalog them, and I'm so happy to say that most of them have a home here at UT. So.
Well, it's an honor to be here. Katie and Bill and Eric, Eric's there. Just to be here among you and feel really privileged to have a little space. I warned Bill I'm not a Cormac McCarthy scholar. I am a fan. I will say that maybe this is too confessional, but all my years in Texas, I thought he was exclusively a Southwest writer and a Southwest person. It wasn't until 2011 I had the good fortune to come here to be the Dean of Libraries that I learned he had this whole other life and he started here. Okay. So that was wonderful because, so many of his works have meant so much to me. So thank you for including me and giving me a chance to talk about the collection. I am all Vol now, but there is a lot of Aggie left in me. One evidence of that, I gave Bill that overly long introduction of myself. Aggies love to brag, even more than regular Texans. So, we're like Texans on steroids. So building collections has been a big part of my professional life. Over my last 15 years, my life is more like that of a banker or a high-level human resources manager. But I still get to have a little bit of fun every now and again, and working with Bill and others to bring the Cormac McCarthy Library, or the largest segment of it, to the University of Tennessee has been a lot of fun and will continue to be a lot of fun. I like to think that book collections tell us something about their owner. The volumes that fill a private library often mirror the owner's taste, passions, and even character. So much so that taken together, they form a kind of material history of a life or career. They can form that. Umberto Eco, who has what I think of as the white whale of author libraries, 30, 40, 50,000 books, once said that even your unread books can define you. I knew a private collector once whose collection we recruited to Texas A&M. He had amassed nearly 10,000 volumes, and he said one of the most frequent questions he got from non-collectors when they saw his private library was, "Have you read all these books?" And his answer was, "Of course not, but I know what's in every single one of them." So people build book collections for many reasons. If you're like me, I'm not very discriminating. I read the books I like and I keep them around until I take them to McKay's. I do have a cord that I try to keep together, but many people collect books for the same reason that others are inspired or driven to collect stamps or baseballs or other things. They think about the material object. They're caught up in the condition of the thing, the association that the books have. Other people collect books or accumulate books because they're scholars. And in the course of their life and doing their scholarship, which is really just, I think of scholarship as a long conversation across time. Those books help inform your part of the conversation and then form a segue for the next scholar to continue the conversation. Others collect for other reasons. And of course, some individuals, all these different collecting motives, they're readers who just have a lot of books that accumulate in their house. They're collectors who are obsessed with condition and focus on one particular area. They're scholars. The books they use or drive their research. There are folks who cross all those boundaries. One person that I think of in this category is Larry McMurtry, who made part of his living as a bookseller and collected books. And if you've ever had the privilege to go to Archer City, at least before Larry passed away, you could see and wander through auto dealerships that he filled with books, and really remarkable. But also a creative writer, but also a scholar of sorts, or at least a public intellectual. But in every case, collections reveal something of their owners. In the case of a great writer, they can also reveal the creative influences that helped shape that writer's work. The Cormac McCarthy Library, numbering roughly 18,000 volumes, offers exactly this sort of opportunity. Now, when Bill introduced me to the individuals from the Cormac McCarthy Society over a year ago now, I think, Stacy Peoples from Center College in Kentucky, who's been organizing the overall effort to catalog the library and publish that catalog with the University of South Carolina Press. The plan is it will be an open access online database, which is really very special and unique for an author's library. But I was excited to hear about their work and to think about how the University of Tennessee might play a role in preserving that line. The plan is that the books will be distributed between three organizations. The Sante Fe Institute, which is a think tank there in Santa Fe, of which Cormac was a member, will get a few of the science books, not very many, a couple of hundred. Texas State University in San Marcos, Texas will get most of the annotated signed books or things that he inscribed. Probably 1,500 to 2,000 of those. And you may know that since at least about 2005, the Cormac McCarthy Archive was acquired by Texas State and is there. So then they've built that collection in two big dollops. They paid a lot of money for the first iteration of the first part of his archive in the early aughts, and then later followed up with another. So I think it's very appropriate that those books go to the Bill Whitliff collection there at Texas State University. And then all the rest, some 16,000, will come to the University of Tennessee. This is not without challenges. I don't have a place to put 16,000 books right now, but we'll figure it out. And even with our new offsite storage facility going up off Middlebrook Pike, it'll be a challenge to ingest all those books, but we're committed to it. We're going to make it happen. I think it's going to be a lot of fun, and it'll be great for Cormac's legacy and to help preserve and his work and contribution. Whenever I'm reading, I'm the kind of speaker that I get nervous if I'm reading, so I always take great care to write everything out. Then I just want to look at you. Inevitably, I lose my place, though, as I've done right now. So, but to think about Cormac, just my impressions of one visit to the home, and I'll show some slides in a moment, some observations of him as a book collector. I'm not a Cormac McCarthy scholar, as I mentioned earlier, but I do know that he didn't have a lot of monetary resources until fairly late in life. So to have accumulated a library of this size and the investment that it took is really remarkable from someone who, couldn't pay the light bills for most of his career. So, but he bought books throughout his career, the evidence suggests from the library. He took great pains to move them as he moved. And with each move, the collection got bigger. When he moved from El Paso to Santa Fe, he went to the great expense to store a number of books there for many years. So just to think of that commitment. He wasn't the kind of collector who maybe you could call, as I referred to earlier, a condition hound. He wasn't really focused on, is this the first or second edition? Does it have these particular points in it? Is the dust jacket the first state of the first dust jacket? He did have an interest in antiquarian books, but from my perception of the library and my brief time there, it was very much a working library for him. It was something that fed his creativity and his interest. I understand that he stopped, according to his brother Dennis, who's also been a big part of the story of the library and helping it be preserved. He stopped reading fiction some number of years, a long time ago, but still was a voracious reader of history, literature, technical manuals of all kinds, and that is evidence in the library. You can see a wide variety of materials. So, of the wealth that he did accumulate, it's amazing to think of how much of it then went into just buying books all the time, going to bookstores, having them shipped to him. So I think I'll show a few of the slides right now from my recent trip out there. And some members of my team, as well as members of the Cormac McCarthy Society. We have, that's me, you know me. Jenny Mezek, Associate Dean for Collections at the University of Tennessee. Jennifer Bills, who's Director of Special Collections. Stacy Peebles in the middle of the two gentlemen in the black t-shirts. She is leading the effort to catalog the collections. The two gentlemen on each side of Stacy are the Elmore twins. They are actual twins. Rick teaches, I think, philosophy at Appalachian State, and Jonathan English at Louisiana Tech. I think I got those. So I don't take them for twins, but somehow it seems in concert with Cormac, maybe some characters from one of Cormac's stories. So we're there in sort of the main living room of the house. You can see the books are in boxes, the books are on shelves. The shelves were built by Cormac, and we're gonna get a few of those shelves. There's boxes and boxes, literally every room of the house is filled with boxes. The shelves are very interesting. They're made so they can be taken apart and sort of form oblong boxes with handholds built into them. And he designed, cut the wood, nailed the wood, joined the wood, stained the wood. And there's a lot of these shelves throughout the house. So, and dual purpose, to store and move the books as well as to display or keep the books in the home. As someone who, not anymore, because my back's already done moving collections. Archivists and librarians are very particular about the kinds of boxes that they move collections in. We don't like boxes that are very big. These bookshelves, Cormac transported the books as he moved around the country. And the shelves themselves have to be, 20 pounds without even any of the books in them. So not the ideal construction project for a library. More boxes of books. That's me looking at Cormac McCarthy's Chicago Manual of Style. A pattern language, towns, buildings, construction. Vegetables from an Italian garden. That's Stacy, and she's holding two of the books from the very last box of books that they cataloged, of the 18,000. One is, I think I've got a time of the Rangers, the Texas Rangers, and then neurobiology of mental illness. So you get, just from this one box, the sort of range of Cormac's reading. And there we are. I think that's maybe down in the basement. You can see these bookshelves again and how the books are stored there. So that's my story of my experience with Cormac's library. Thank you.
Time to ask questions afterwards, but we do have one more part, and that is Eric Dawson, who's going to show us some film. And I first met Eric a while ago when we put together a project of, he is an archivist. He's worked at TAMIS for I think a decade, and then more recently he's the head of the McClung Collection that's part of the Knox County Libraries. And just specializes in history and archives, and just does an amazing job of especially images and film, and just sort of finding, if you follow him on Instagram, you see he's always sending out little gems that he found. And so we got together one time to put together a film that he put together with a band that played over it and played music, but I will leave that here, but he's going to show us a little bit about some of his work in that area.
Thanks, Bill. My most recent share was Jingle from Petros in the 1990s, where we found an advertising commercial. Wanted to pay respect to them as they leave us. As Bill mentioned, we worked together on a film that was sort of compiled from archival materials, both film and photographs, based around Suttree. And we did it again several years later at Lakeshore Park with big ears. Did anybody here happen to see either of those? So you guys are a little bit ahead of the explanation here, but basically, as Bill mentioned, I worked at Tennessee Archive Moving Images and Sound for about 10 years. And as I was watching, I'm a big fan of Cormac and Suttree in particular. And I'm just going to roll this video and talk over it, pretend it's like a DVD commentary or something. It's like about a 12-minute excerpts from this hour-long to 70-minute long second version film. And as I watched hours and hours of home movies, news footage, industrial films shot and made in East Tennessee and Knoxville. And as I was watching them, being a fan of Suttree, occasionally something would catch my eye that would remind me of it. The very first thing was seeing the houseboats, an 8mm home movie that showed some of the houseboats on the Tennessee River. Now, I know there's photographs in TBA and McClung Collection, but I've never really given it much thought until I saw those moving images. And I thought, oh, that's interesting, just like Suttree. And then I saw footage of the Goat Man, whom I did not know was a real person as well. So I was like, oh, this is interesting. So I just started collecting these clips. And at some point, and maybe the point coming up here is that point, I was really surprised to come across this footage. The book opens Suttree with them dragging the river for a suicide. And there in the WDR news footage, there is footage of police and emergency workers doing just that. I tried to go into the Knoxville News Sentinel archives and look up who this might have been, but perhaps not surprisingly, there were a lot of suicides off the Gay Street Bridge and Henry Street Bridge at that time. I was really shocked. I limited my search to just the 50s pretty much, and it ended up being quite a few. Now, the book takes place circa 1950. When I started compiling this footage, I cheated a little because, sometimes cities don't change that much and areas don't change that much. So we're talking like circa 1940s to 1960s footage in here. But what I did was sort of compile it in a sort of somewhat chronological order as things happen in the book. We had initially with Buddy in the Huddle, we included text from the book so you could see, for those that weren't as familiar with it, how closely it matched what was in the writings. So, all of these places describe tons of photos in the McClung Collection and film footage showing up in the Tennessee Archive of Moving Images and Sound. So the idea was like everybody knows Suttree, well, everybody's a fan. knows that it's semi-autobiographical work, but the more you look into the images of the time and see what's there, you see just how realistic it is. I liken it, I know many people have, I'm sure, to people talk about James Joyce Ulysses being such a good map of Dublin in the 20s, and that's the case with, I think, with Suttree. It's sort of like if you read that book and you compare images, you can see that it's a realistic sort of a depiction of the city. And other than entertainment, which I think it was, I think it was, both these events were pretty entertaining. I think it was some stuff I just put in there, that was Leonard Shursky in front of the Blue Circle, Shursky's cousin. And some of the stuff, the images were cool. They don't have anything particular to do with the book, but they were of the era. Clearly this has something to do with the book. So much of it takes place on the river. There's the houseboats, there's flooding, there's so much action going on there. But as I was saying, I think there's a lot of research and sort of things to be gleaned from McCarthy's work by looking at these images that maybe is untapped. This was a fun and entertaining thing to do, but it's also, I think, illustrative of what's happening in the book to look at some of these images. I'll just go ahead and say some of the things you won't see. This, like I said, it's 12 minutes and the film ran to an hour. The mountain trip, you remember, for those who read the book, the passage where he goes into the mountains, it's the only color footage in the book. I kept the black and white to sort of depict the kind of mood and tone of the city, the scruffy little city at the time. And then he goes to the mountains and there's some mushrooms and sort of like, for a while at least, has an okay time. So we did that in color, and that section ends actually with, we have a shot of somebody walking in the Bryson City. You see the sign Bryson City, so if you read the book, you know that's where it ends up. Who's this guy? I don't know, but he looks like he could be in that book, right? And here's the aforementioned houseboat sort of footage. Not great looking, but it was shot in 8mm in the 1940s, so you can only expect so much quality to come through. But. And, I've not even dug into, this is all McClung and Tamas. TBA and UT also has, so many photos and perhaps moving images that would fit a project like that as well. But just limiting to that, I think we ended up with pretty rich mining of material, which is to say, and we showed it a third time. That was the Southern Festival of the Book last year with William Tyler. We had readers, including Ron Rash. Okay, I'm going to pause a moment and so everyone can read this. You read the text and then watch the footage afterwards. Great passage, and it's powerful stuff when you're seeing it on a big screen with people, and you've got people who compose music specifically for it. But this is another example. These several reels of workhouse footage shot for WBR television in the 1960s, and the description that we just saw weaves in quite well. The prelude to this is time in the courts as well. I don't know. I'll go ahead and admit. Talk about this a lot with film archivists, sort of about the ethics of using footage and how you do. And, no one here knew this was going to, their footage was going to end up being used like this, or that certainly gave permission. So there's some questions I have sometimes about using this in this way, but and speaking of ethics, someone contacted me about a year ago, and they wanted this film so they could run it through AI, and they were going to put Jack Neely's face in there, RB Morrison's in it. Yeah, I was, that was a year ago. AI has like come a long way since then, and it was amusing at the time. But you go to McClung Collection, you can just take those photos offline. They're low res images, but we do have our digital collection online, as does UT. No one could have imagined a day when people would just be taking those photos and animating them and adding things to them. And, you know, like as an archivist, I find it a little disturbing, frankly, and the whole idea of taking something like this and then running it through that and adding it. I'm not a fan, but I also I'm coming to realize that's going to be inevitable. We're not going to have control over this stuff. We don't already have control over it once it's out. But to that point, what I was saying about TBA and UT having different collections that would match this, we've done 3 versions of this, and each one's a slightly different cut because things just keep coming in, and I keep finding more things. So it's sort of like an endlessly, movable part. It's the Goat Man. Do you guys know about Goat Man? WBR did a piece on him years ago. That was, not just this is BR footage, but then when they were having their 50th anniversary, they did sort of
There is actually a full-length documentary
oh, right?
on the Goat Man, an hour long.
Okay, so this is the only picture, spoiler alert, the only picture I've seen of the huddle. And it starts out from that big, panoramic thing that you wouldn't notice unless you look really close and you see it there. This is not the huddle, this is the Three Feathers Lounge. It's a little artistic license here. This is the Three Feathers Lounge, which was down on the corner of Jackson and Gay. That was Arthur Q. Smith, the songwriter. This is from a Knoxville Police Department training film. But it just don't seem to I mean, this is right. Going back to the huddle a minute. Just what I was saying about AI. There's immersive experiences like the Van Gogh or the South Pro Valley, and I guess we're getting one here.
Yeah.
Life through a huddle. This immersive you're into. I would not want to leave it like this, however. Of course, okay, so this is section, he gets hit in the head with the floor buffer. This is not him, that guy's smoking a cigarette, but it's the only footage we have of somebody being carted in an ambulance. Completely different footage here at the hospital. I like that it's out of focus because he got hit in the head. So there's a perfect focus, and the camera just did that itself. Okay, the ending, we're going to say there's quite a bit of poetic license here because you're going to see a sign of the new Knoxville. So this was during the period of urban renewal, and this is kind of a heavy-handed point I was making at the end, but of course, the period of urban renewal did begin around 1950, and the destruction of McAnally Flats toward the end of the book, I've always read as sort of like, that's one of the impetuses for him moving or leaving. I mean, I know he has some work to do on himself, and that's part of it, but he also doesn't like what's happening to the city around him. And all this footage is from the 60s. I think it still echoes the kind of like the changing times that he was seeing and how things weren't going to be as exciting or live at the same way. Overall, plenty of cuts throughout the book, and there were more cuts through the film, but I think the book holds up in some way because of that, and we try to make this point in the film. Issues of homelessness, police brutality, racism, all of that stuff obviously still with us. In some ways, it's strong as ever. What a great shot, right? I should also make a note, throughout it, you've seen different kind of image quality. That's because some of this stuff was transferred 20 years ago or 18 years ago. And since then, we've, technology's gotten better and we can do more. So ideally, if this were ever to be screened again, we would rescan all this to digital in a much nicer, cleaner look. You recognize probably a lot of these. These were going to be taken by urban renewal. That's why they were being filmed, some of them, or the areas. I don't know anything else, even having okay, and I had to put the lays in because that was, when we did it Lakeshore, that was around the time of the stadium and controversy, and we wanted to be sure to have lays there. All right, so just for those of you who didn't, Barry is leading the city there. Yeah, like I said, I've had these films, these clips assembled. In 2018, Bill approached me about doing something for McCarthy Fest. I've got just the thing. I never in a million years would I dreamed we would get Buddy in the Huddle to come here and play at the Bijou, which is what they did. Jack Newman wrote it. I only knew about him because Jack wrote a story about him in the Metropulse years ago. They were a German band who were besotted with this book, so much so that they came here in the 90s and spent, I don't know, how long did they spend? They spent several weeks and recorded 2 imaginary soundtracks. So sometimes when I would be putting this film together, I'd be listening to Buddy in the Huddles, Suttree imaginary soundtracks. And how are we going to get a band from Nuremberg to come here and do this? But lo and behold, the team effort with UT, we got the Goethe Center out of Atlanta involved, and other great partners, and we're able to have that great show. We based it sort of around their songs, so when we had time to do it again, I was approached by Big Ears. This was during the pandemic. The vaccine finally arrived, and they were like, hey, we need to do some big outdoor production. So they invited to do a reprise of this there. Again, different edit. This one was more chronological. You can see the people performing. RB was actually, rather than have text, RB actually read all of that. What else to tell you? That's just about it. Again, the larger point I wanted to make is like, yeah, these are all old. This was entertaining, a great experience, but I do think these collections of audiovisual materials and photographs are sort of a great untapped sort of research tool for McCarthy scholars. That's my 2 cents. And now we will take questions of anyone.
So one thing before that, just because I was reminded as Buddy in the Huddle, we had a chance to meet the lead singer whose name was Roland Kopp. Unfortunately, he passed away not too long ago. But when he came here, we spent time with him. He was thinking about, this was in 2018, he's thinking about the difference of Knoxville between 2018 and 1990s when he came. And he said to me, he said, Bill, when I look at Knoxville, I feel glad for you and sad for me. I said, well, what do you mean? And he said, I'm glad for you because it's such a more exciting and vibrant city. And I'm sad for me because I can no longer see Suttree in the city. Because when he came back in the 90s, he felt it was all still there. And when he came back in 2018, it was no longer there for him.
Okay.
So you got a question?
Yeah, the question about style in Suttree, obviously it's a major topic, and that doesn't surprise me. Just your comments about the low life and the high style of Suttree.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great question. When I talk about Suttree the most in this book, I talk about it in a chapter where I say some of his bigger texts is more like epic. He's got this epic intent in mind. I think that works really well with that he's writing for a larger audience. He has this idea of, I don't know, history in mind and just a larger scale. So I think the connection to Ulysses is a really good one, where he is trying to write about the, early on in that book, he says he's writing about the parts of Knoxville that you pass by in car and carriage, and basically roll up your window and ignore, right? So he's trying to talk about the parts of any city, but Knoxville in particular, that most people don't want to pay attention to because it's unpleasant, it's scary, it's, whatever. Unhoused people, poor people, and then just people who don't quite fit into the routines of society. So that's sort of the subject matter, yeah. So there's a lot of low down, dirty stuff, but then he writes about it often in such a high tone, and he has a lot of literary allusions and a lot of, so he's clearly trying to, at least in my mind, make an epic statement about this dirty little town that he both has real love for, I think, and then is also frustrated by it. So he's got some of my favorite passages in this. He calls it a mongrel architecture growing up out of the mud plains with no design or intent or something like that. Just here's a sense of like, who thought of this?
Do you see that? Do you see that as working with the novel, or do you see it as a distraction
Well,
from?
I like it, but that is where I think people who think he is too stylized, they do see it as a distraction. I think that is fair enough, that if you feel, you want to hear the story about the characters and then somebody's going off on these tangents and, he was clearly I write in the book that he really had a love for experimentation and really liked literary experimentation. I think you can see that there. A fair assessment might be, well, maybe you could experiment a little less and work on. So I see the detractions from it, but I sort of like that each book feels different. That one feels unique too. Yeah. And he does, as Eric's film shows, he does such a wonderful job of capturing a sense of the town.
He does. Thank you.
Any other questions?
What is something unexpected that was found in this library or something you wouldn't expect to be in this collection of books?
Well, Bill's as qualified as I am to take that question on. You spent time going through boxes and inventorying them with
I just saw a select number of boxes that were from El Paso, though. They were very dusty. What comes to your mind?
well, just for me to the picture Cormac McCarthy's Chicago manual style. Now, I'm an old librarian, and I was raised in the print world and then transitioned into the electronic world. I don't understand how students use style manuals anymore because they don't exist in paper anymore. Actually, I'm such a nerd that when we were first married, my wife Natalie's here tonight, her mother, I think it's our first Christmas together, gave me my own copy of the Chicago Manual. So to see there and it's to hold that and imagine, how Cormac might have used that and other things like that. And I think also, rather than any particular book, just the wide range of reading as evidenced by, that one of those last images I've showed from the last box. Here's a history of the Texas Rangers next to a work of neuroscience.
Yeah, I would agree with that you could sort of get a chronology of the books as you were going through them, although not always. Sometimes you didn't know when they come from, but you could sort of figure out the era. And it was interesting to see his growing interest in theoretical mathematics, physics, neuroscience, and all those sort of things. And early on, he almost had Idiot's Guide to Neuroscience, but he had very introductory books, and then they got more and more advanced. I think as he read in that field. So yeah, if you've read his later stuff and is interested in those, it's kind of interesting to see that pick up maybe about a decade before those started to show up in his writing.
Then does that breadth exposure that he's putting for himself, does that make decoding his language or discussing how his language worked more difficult?
I think you definitely have to think about it in stages for sure. So in this book, I think this might be the first book that is published that the timing was right, so that these last two books of his are in here in a complete chapter. A few of them are mentioned, but I think that's going to end up coming, it's going to look stupid once people learn more about it, because I was writing about it when we really didn't know anything about it. But I do think you do have to, you cannot look at those in the same way you can look at earlier ones, because he's got a different vocabulary, a different sensibility. He's using chaos theory and various, sort of abstract mathematics as a sort of language to talk about. But one thing I found interesting about it is he seems to sort of come back to the same issues about the meaning of life, about what can we know, indeterminacy, but he just finds a different language to do that. So that stuff is in his work from the 60s, 70s, but I think he found through the language of some of those advanced sciences and mathematics a new way to approach some of the same subjects.
Yes, sir.
Did you collaborate with people at the Sante Fe Institute on this, or did they bring him in because of his interest in complexity and chaos?
I don't know how much they collaborated with his work, and if anybody else knows, please chime in. But I will say that he loved to hang out there, and he loved to talk with scientists. There are a few other art and humanities people, he said they bored him, but he loved to hang out with the scientists. And I think they liked to have him there too, and more than just a famous person over there. I think they, if you go back, if you look at the Sante Fe Institute now, there's some really moving tributes to him and what he meant there. And the reason I think they got some of the books is they're going to build a library, sort of library exhibit about honoring McCarthy and his presence there. So, I think he liked to talk with them. I think they were surprised at one anecdote that I read from the authors. He was talking about what would it look like if a meteor hit the world, sort of end of life stuff, and the disappearance of the dinosaurs and some of those things. And this guy wondered why he was so obsessed with that. And then he read The Road later and said, "Oh, okay, it was brainstorming." So I do think he probably had certain topics that were interesting for his writing as well. Yeah.
Now, what if you could help me resolve a conflict in my inner monologue? People often ask me, I'm a native East Tennessean and Cormac is not.
Yep.
James Agee was a native East Tennessean, right? Cormac was not. So people ask me, who would you recommend to learn the most about East Tennessee in terms of style and outlook on life and perspective? Would you recommend which of the following three? Cormac McCarthy, James Agee, or Kaz Walker? I've got it down to three. So
Well, what text from Kaz Walker would you read? No, I will say one thing about, I love James Agee too. So this is your inner monologue, so I'm not sure I'm going to resolve that. But, one of the things that interests me, I think, from McCarthy is how much he loved regional voices and recorded those. And I sometimes wonder if that came precisely because he wasn't from here, his family wasn't from here, so he heard it in a way that's different, So I think those of us who have moved around, I think sometimes you hear more acutely places that doesn't naturally come to you. It can be hard to write about a place where everything is you just assume. So I wondered sometimes, he moved here when he was 4, so all of his memory life was here, but I wonder if, growing up in a family that was not from here and being distant in some ways gave him a especially acute ear to record the place. So yeah, he's in some ways not from here, but I think he spent more time listening to some of that than a lot of people.
I'd like to add a little bit, if I may, that part of the reason I think that I never thought about or did not realize McCarthy had a connection to East Tennessee or any place other than Texas and the Southwest is his books are so authentic to that experience. So if you've ever spent time in West Texas and then you read No Country for Old Men, the language and the interactions, maybe not the violence, it's not as violent as all that. It's just so spot on for that culture. So I think that, it had something to do with being an outsider in different places, can often observe something that may be harder for us if we're from a place. I'll also say you all know, you're from here, you know the expression better than I do. I don't care to, how that means yes. So when I moved here, my first week here, someone said, if you ask someone for something and they say, I don't care to, that means yes. And then they explained it's their way of saying, I don't mind. Well, in the crossing, which is not said here, that expression is used as they're going up to get traps from a cabin. And the owner of the traps isn't there, and the person directing them uses a version of that he wouldn't care to. I never heard that in Texas or the Southwest. So it's also just interesting how that bit of East Tennessee goes with him there. And I'll also say, Texas wouldn't exist without Tennesseans. So, all of that pride of place comes from here.
He knows his audience.
I was just gonna say, you forgot one, and that would be the lyrics of Dolly Parton.
Hey.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question. Anyone? Yes, sir.
Suttree is viewed kind of as a distinct novel in his body of work. It's maybe the funniest and the most about Knoxville. He returns to Knoxville in The Passenger, and there's some humor in there also that's like Suttree. When looking at his language and style, did you see the way that he was writing about Knoxville change or evolve, or did you see it as a return, like, oh, here's that characteristic, like, style and way that he writes about Knoxville, or did it change when you returned to that time?
I think that's one of the places that chapter's going to end up looking stupid once we learn more about it, because one of the things we do know is that he had been working on some version of The Passenger, which was published in 2022, as early as 1980. So some of that difference may not be that far. I think the archives just released this material. I have not seen it, but I think we'll learn a lot about, hopefully we'll learn when certain parts of it. So maybe some of this was written very, Suttree was published in 79, so very near that. And so maybe it's fresh in there. The other thing that I think is interesting, one thing I found actually at UT's special collections when I was doing this that I had read before, but it wasn't until Passenger came out. We know that in the archives, goes back to the thing that he would listen to stories that he heard, the voices he'd heard. Sometimes he'd just write little sketches, making up a story of somebody telling. Sometimes he'd record a story that he heard at a bar or somewhere, and he would put them in a folder that was not connected to any specific text necessarily. He just had a folder of regional voices, And then he'd pull them out, try them in one novel, and it didn't work there, take them out, but then put them in another novel. And one thing that was in special collections is he wrote letters to John Fergus Ryan in Memphis right around 1980, and he talks about an anecdote where he heard his friend Gary Goodman tell just a sort of funny joke. It was pretty funny, kind of a throwaway line, but that was in 1980, and then it shows up in here. So he uses that exact anecdote from his friend, puts it in the voice of one of the characters sitting in the bar, as sort of a humorous aside. So it's hard to know exactly, was that in a folder for 40 years, or was it in an early draft of this that it stayed in? And you've been to the thing, so maybe you have some light.
There's a line from Passenger in an early draft for Suttree.
Yeah.
With the plane in the water. So I think that image might have been in his head for a long time.
Be a very different book with the plane drowning in the water of the Tennessee River.
Oh, yeah.
Well, we're at time here, so I want to thank everybody here for showing up.
Yeah. And I just, before we leave, I was afraid that I didn't mention Suttree in my part, that I might get in trouble. So I brought these things. I put together a walking tour of Cormac McCarthy's Suttree with some quotes and a little map. So if anybody's interested, I have a whole bunch of those to grab one before you take off. Thanks for coming.
See.